Hey guys, this is the rest of chapter 23. I'm going to finish the chapter. I'm going to talk about one subject that I didn't really cover enough. I know it's just a review, but I always want to make sure I cover things in great detail when I can. In the last half of the chapter, I mentioned the multiple reasons behind why the United States got involved in World War One. The most obvious is submarines, things that Germany did. Unrestricted submarine warfare is the big phrase. The Zimmerman telegram, trying to convince Mexico, had a very bad relationship with the United States. A lot of American soldiers were actually stationed on the border with Mexico at the time, if you remember the whole Mexican intervention drama. So anyway, the Zimmerman telegram, which was related to that was a big contributing factor. There was also like espionage other than connections with Mexico, but there was like German espionage and even sabotage in the United States. So all those things were obviously directly related to why the United States eventually changed its mind about getting involved in the war. I had mentioned some behind the scenes things as well. For instance, the banking stuff. So I've got a little section called More on the American Entry into the War, and I'm going to cover that now. So while all the drama between U-boats and merchant ships was going on, there were other less conspicuous, and that word means conspicuous means obvious or out in the open. So less conspicuous, less obvious. So less conspicuous factors that led the United States into war. One of the most important involved American banks and American industry, and that means that it involved the House of Morgan, as it's called. J.P. Morgan, who we talked about, an American financier, banker. He's dominant. The Morgan Empire in the United States, the industrial empire, dominated this era in American politics and especially in American industry and the economy. So J.P. Morgan was an American financier and banker who dominated corporate finance on Wall Street throughout the Progressive era. As the head of the banking firm that ultimately became known as J.P. Morgan and Co. Company, he was the driving force behind the wave of industrial consolidation in the United States and a prominent figure of the Progressive era. And that's the late 1800s and early 1900s. You guys hopefully know that at this point. Now, Morgan wasn't just a banker. His mergers, the combination of huge corporations, they're going to create massive corporations with unprecedented, immense power in the United States. Now, eventually, when Morgan Sr. dies, he's going to pass on his financial and industrial empire to his son, J.P. Morgan Jr., creatively named. And so the range of holdings of his family empire, ranging from railroads, banks, steel companies, electric industries, innovation, invention, across the board, all those things collectively are known as the House of Morgan. So if I say that again, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not just talking about the dude's house or the family's properties. I mean the network of, we talk about vertical integration, but the network of industrial, economic, financial assets that this family had. So anyway, the House of Morgan had loaned huge sums of money to Britain and France during the very early stages of World War One. And that didn't seem like a very risky thing because no one could really even conceive of a war so destructive that it could actually threaten a collapse of either Britain or France, because those are enormously powerful empires. So it seemed a safe bet to loan these countries money to reap the reward of interest payments. Once the war reached a shocking scale that seemed to threaten France's actual survival, American creditors, that is, those who did the loaning, were worried that they could potentially experience a massive loss. Okay, so the financial relationship between the United States and the European powers involved in this war, that another word for that is the belligerents. That's obviously not a neutral relationship. So just because the United States isn't sending soldiers and warships and doing actual fighting on a battlefield, it does not mean that the United States was totally neutral. So there's obvious favoritism going on. Now, that matters because the United States had, and Wilson expressed specifically neutrality. And they didn't say like sort of neutrality. They were talking about full neutrality. And the U.S. State Department, okay, the branch of American government responsible for foreign policy, relationships with other countries, the guy who was heading the State Department at the time, William Jennings Bryan. If you know who that is, then this will be more significant to you. If you don't worry about it. He's not going to be on your test. Well, there is no test. I have to get out of the habit of saying that. And he may be in the main point. Who knows? Anyway, William Jennings Bryan, Secretary of State, ran for president before that. If you've been reading your book, you know something about him. Anyway, very much against financial support of any belligerents. He took neutrality seriously. He was one of the few. And so here's a quote so you know. Bryan said to the president, Wilson, quote, refusal to loan to any belligerents would naturally tend to hasten a conclusion to the war. Hasten means to quicken up. Obviously, as we can see, there is a massive economic motivation for the United States to join the war. Again, that doesn't mean that's the only reason or even the biggest reason, but there was a very clear economic motivation for the banking class to join this war. Now, when you're analyzing this, it's not like the average person cares that much about what bankers want or what JP Morgan wants, but anybody who's breathing in the United States knows that the average voter doesn't have anywhere near, if any at all, the leverage that like a Bezos nowadays would have, or a Morgan, even more so back then. So it's no shock to anyone that large corporate bosses, leaders of corporations, very, very rich people who are important to the economy, they have, if not all of, a majority of the influence on politicians. And so there are many things, behind the scenes that you can imagine that could be going on. I'm not going to get into all of that. I don't want to make it sound too conspiratorial, but the obvious conflict of interest is established by history. Now we're going to talk about another very important topic, World War I and the power of American government. Now, for obvious reasons, during World War I, the American federal government saw it necessary to dramatically extend its own powers. So the biggest example is the War Industries Board. Long story short there, War Industries Board, they mobilized industry, controlled labor, and rationed food. So basically ran the economy, that may sound like, okay, well, we know about World War II, and I mean, with everything going on now with the coronavirus, how the government is stepping in and, leading in very specific ways to organize a national effort for a certain goal. It may not be as weird to you now, but at the time this was unprecedented, and it would have been controversial had people not been caught up in nationalism and war fever and things like that. But anyway, it was new. It was historically significant. So now wars, especially modern war, they're very expensive, and they cost a lot of money. And so you got to pay for them. And we talked about the breakdown of how governments nowadays pay for wars. The most obvious and logical that you could think of would be like raising taxes. So the government gets money by taxing people. And then so if you need a lot more money, you raise taxes. And then the other, just to knock out the other ways, war bonds, okay, that is the government borrowing money from people. And you buy a war bond, you're loaning the government money. Why would people do that? Other than just patriotism? You get paid interest back. And so the thing there is that society has to get taxed more at some point to pay for that. The government doesn't create anything. It can create money, but not wealth. And I'll explain the difference in a minute. So either way, it's taxes now or taxes later. And then the other way, which is the least conspicuous, to use that word again, is printing money. So the United States will institute new taxes. Taxes are definitely going to go up significantly, but that's not enough. So the United States government will sell a ton of war bonds. That's not enough. Now, even so, propaganda and marketing, those are going to be used to urge many Americans to buy as many bonds as possible. And so anyway, because of the war bonds, national debt is going to soar from $2 billion to $20 billion in 3 years. Now, saying that now is a joke because we're talking about the United States debt now it was $23 trillion the other day, but it's going to be, I don't even want to talk about it. But so 20 billion is a joke. If our debt was 20 billion now, it'd be, I can't even comprehend how good of a thing that would be. But anyway, so that's taxes, bonds. And I mentioned printing money, so the next section is going to zero in a little bit more on that printing money. I'm not going to get into a in-depth technical explanation on exactly how the Federal Reserve prints money. I mean, because it's not a one-step thing. It's not like, okay, they just start running. It's a process. But anyway, here comes the Federal Reserve. That's what I titled the next section. So while raising taxes seems like the most obvious way to pay for war, it involves something that may decrease support for war. While most economists, including Adam Smith, if you've heard of him, good for you. If not, don't worry about it. That's not to be discussed now. That's a whole nother thing. Anyway, believed this was a good thing because it would actually reduce the likelihood of a war. People wouldn't want to raise their taxes. They say, oh, well, if I've got to pay more, I don't really support the war. But if you want the opposite, if you want war, okay, if you want people to want war, then raising taxes isn't good because they might not want to. So is there a way to try to figure out, paying for a war but not making people as upset about it? Well, war bonds, a lot, for whatever reason, a lot of people don't realize that if the government is borrowing money and paying off debt, it's going to have to tax more at some point to pay off the debt, and then even more to pay off the interest. But because people just don't think about that, I guess, or it's not as offensive to them as the word tax, I'm not sure the psychology, it's easier for governments to raise a bunch of money by going into debt. And the third element, which is the Federal Reserve is all about, is that, and if the debt gets too high, well, just print money. And when I was a kid, one of the biggest, most confusing things I didn't understand is like, well, if the country runs out of money, why don't we just print more? We could just print, and everybody could be a millionaire. And the problem there is inflation. That is, the more money you have, not the more wealth or production, but the more money, the less that money is worth. So prices just go up. So if the government just doubles the amount of money, then everything's going to cost twice as much, supply and demand. And so you may say, well, okay, well, if inflation happens, then how does that help the government? Well, if the government owes you money, they don't owe you a certain amount of value. They owe you a certain amount of dollars. And if the value of the dollars goes down, that means they don't have to pay you back quite as much, or anyone else they owe. And also, if the value of money goes down, it means that people who've been saving money, well, that money's not worth as much. So it's almost like, a good analogy in my head is if you're standing on the beach and you tell yourself, I am not moving. I'm not going to move. If someone tries to shove me, I'm going to stay still. Don't ask me why this scenario exists. Just run with it. And someone comes up to you, they try to shove you, you don't even move. And you're like, that's it. No one can shove me. Meanwhile, the waves have crashed in, they've pulled sand, and over time, underneath your feet, the sand that was there has been pulled away, slowly but surely. So you don't notice it as much. You still feel like you're standing in the same place. But if you're really being technical about it, you're not standing on the exact same ground after a certain amount of time. Well, that's sort of the way that the Federal Reserve can get money from you. They don't literally have to take dollars out of your bank account. If they print more and create that out of thin air, then how much your money is worth is a little bit less. So in essence, just for argument's sake, let's say you have $1 in your bank account, okay? And let's say the Federal Reserve doubles the money, okay? You still have $1 in your bank account, but everything costs twice as much now. So the actual value of that dollar in order to do something with it, which is, the point of the dollar, they've essentially taken half of your purchasing power. So they didn't take your dollar, but they took half of what your dollar could do, which again is the whole point. So because people aren't really thinking about that, maybe they don't even know what the Federal Reserve is, which most people don't. I mean, I didn't. I didn't even when I was a college student. I didn't know it either. So I'm not trying to be stuck up. I'm just saying that works to the less you know, the easier you are to manipulate. The easier you are to convince to do something that's against your own interest. The easier you are to take advantage of, and you don't even know it. So people who are well informed, people who take their rights their liberties seriously are much less convenient for a government who, wants to do what it wants anyway. So with this new Federal Reserve and the manipulation of the currency, inflation will set in. In 4 years, from 1916 to 1920, prices are going to shoot up 70%. So everything is 70% more expensive than it was 4 years ago in order to grow that military and to cover the cost of the war. All right, so that's Federal Reserve. We're still talking about power of the American government. One big example, the Selective Service Act. Okay, Selective Service Act, drafting people. That did not happen before. If you know, early on in American history, it was all about militia. They were most of the founding fathers, a good portion of them, I guess it's debatable whether we say most or not, but a good, healthy portion of the founding fathers didn't even like the idea of a standing army. They thought it was a recipe for tyranny. So anyway, the idea that people could be compelled to fight or to serve in a federal army, it just shows that there's a very different set of values in the 19 teens than there were in 1770, 1780, 1790. Another thing, the managers of these giant American corporations, J.P. Morgan, they're going to sort of serve their country, quote unquote, by basically pulling together an efficient war production system for the United States. So under that whole War Industries Board. So another element of increased power by the federal government will be the size of the government. The number of federal employees are going to double during World War I. I mean, double. Free speech is going to be severely curtailed. The Espionage and Sedition Acts of 1917 and 1918 actually outlawed criticism of the government. It outlawed criticism of leaders and war policies, and you're going to have about 1,000 convictions. So, freedom of speech, well, not in an emergency. We've talked about several other important changes. Read your books, but I wanted to just remind you guys of those again. Now, America's early role in the war, we covered that too. The United States was new at this whole large-scale army thing, did not have a large army at all. The big fight there was French and British military leadership wanted to disperse American soldiers in their armies, meaning that they didn't want the United States to build its own big army and then come over. They wanted to go ahead and take American soldiers and quickly train them on their own and basically just use the United States manpower. But the United States, come on, that's the least American thing I can think of. We weren't having that. So we put our own army together, led by General Pershing. Early on in the war, American forces distinguished themselves as reliable in defense. Okay, offensive operations are inherently more complicated than the defense. American soldiers, for the most part, were respected for, fighting tough with ferocity, being stubborn. And so the United States will help tip the scale of the war, eventually help defeat the German Empire. And the big, why did Germany lose? Well, it's not that their army was totally defeated. I mean, it was, they experienced a ton of casualties. But basically, the German economy could no longer sustain the war. It was collapsing from the inside. So losses on the battlefield, resources going, losses of colonies around the world. Germany had some before World War I. Losses of supplies, food from the blockade. The German economy collapsed. Now, back to American domestic stuff, we need to remember two of the biggest changes that happened in the United States domestically in terms of civil liberties, African Americans and women. Okay, due to this unprecedented emergency for the United States and sending over such a huge number of working age men, white men, there is going to be a gap. There was a huge need for people working in factories, for police auxiliary, for helping with propaganda efforts to convince more people to buy war bonds. And so it's a huge opportunity for women in all of those capacities. And then also for African Americans, sometimes people ask me okay, well, after the Civil War, obviously whites in the South, for the most part, did not want freedmen or former slaves living there anymore. Wouldn't they have been happy if they left? And then also, on the same side of that, wouldn't blacks have a reason to want to leave? And the answer is, well, yeah, but I mean, it's not really possible. It takes money. It's a lot of risk. And the fact that, and this is sort of overlooked a lot, is that anytime African Americans from the South did try to leave, they were viciously rebuffed. I mean, it's not like the North was just, the cities up north were like opening their doors. They were literally doing the opposite. They were, in some cases, in different eras in American history, literally putting up roadblocks. And there's violence and racial tension, which is a nice way to put it, in northern and midwestern cities as well. So this sort of is a foot in the door opportunity for African Americans, because there are going to be factories that need somebody, and this desperate need for labor is going to be an opportunity. And so it's what's known as the Great Migration. It's almost 500,000 blacks, for about 400,000, are going to migrate north from the south during this time because of the new opportunity. And like I said, it's going to lead to more racial tension. It's going to lead to demographic shifts. We'll talk more about that in future chapters. But, race riots, violence, all that stuff. And then, again, this is an era of the expansion of women's rights in the United States, especially politically. Women were needed by their country to leave their traditional roles as homemaker more than ever before. Women were crucial to organizing war bond drives. There had already been a women's suffrage movement, and this is it's going to be a tremendous boost for that movement, that women are now so obviously necessary for the war machine. And I don't mean just as nurses and things like that, though that was significant too. You can have soldiers on the front lines, but in modern warfare, if factories are not churning out ammunition and guns and supplies, trucks, then that force cannot fight. So everyone had to pull in the same direction, and that's exactly what's going to happen. Another thing that we covered in chapter 23 was what was called the beginnings of a new rivalry. Don't forget that World War I is what brought about the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union sort of shocked the world. Communism was mutually exclusive with capitalism, or is, and there was a threat to the democratic capitalist world that communist ideals could infect them as well. And so there's going to be a very aggressive effort to end communism really before it gets started. During World War I, the Russian Empire collapsed. It lost to Germany. We don't talk much about the Eastern Front in World War I, but Germany did win initially on the Eastern Front. And the result of that was that Russia fell apart. It's going to devolve into a civil war. And Russia's former allies, the UK and France, were actually as hostile to the communist revolution as they were to Germany. And so after Russia fell into revolution at the end of World War I, and we're talking August 1918, 14 nations, including the United States, Britain, and France, are going to actually send soldiers to Russia to intervene in the civil war there and to fight against the communists, known as the Reds. And the Reds are eventually going to win that civil war, the communists, and they're never going to forget the intervention. It's sort of the introduction to relations with the rest of the world. From the Russian perspective from the Soviet perspective, was they tried to kill us in the crib, but they couldn't, and now we know we've got their number. Another thing we talked about was the Middle East during and after World War I. As we all know, the United States has a pretty touchy history with the Middle East over the years. Understanding what happened in the Middle East after World War I is necessary to understanding the situation today. If you start your understanding with what you see on the news or something that happened in the 1960s, then you do not understand the situation. You can't, no matter what your opinion is, it doesn't matter. It has to be based in what's actually happened. And so World War I is a necessary element to that. So we talked about in the Middle East, there was long before World War I, the Ottoman Empire ran things. Okay, the Ottoman Empire is it was an Islamic empire, but it was a Turkish empire. For those who don't even know the difference there, Arab is an ethnicity. It's a language, Arabic, but it's an ethnicity. Arab and Muslim or Islam is not the same thing. You can be a Muslim Arab. You could be a Muslim Turk. The reason that I'm saying that isn't to just be pedantic. It's to cover that the Ottoman Empire, Turkish Empire, ran things in Mesopotamia. okay? Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine. And so over the last 100 years, really, the British and the French, but mostly the British, had been sort of taking chunks out of the Ottoman Empire, which was huge at one point. During World War I, the Ottoman Empire, they're going to join Germany because from their perspective, Britain was the biggest threat to their empire, so it made sense to go to war on Germany's side and Austria-Hungary's side. The British, of course, they wanted to knock out the Ottoman Empire. They wanted to knock them out quickly, and so they could focus on Germany. I mean, if you've heard of Gallipoli, that's where that battle comes from, is trying to invade Turkey and knock them out of the war. It was a massive failure. It didn't work. So the next best thing is going to be to try to start a guerrilla war, part of the Ottoman Empire, namely in modern day Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq. And so they're going to send a special forces expert, we'll call him, T.E. Lawrence, not Trevor Lawrence, to this region to start an Arab revolt in Palestine. Now, in order to secure Arab help against the Turkish Ottomans, the British are going to promise to set up independent Arab countries in this part of the world as long as they help defeat the Ottomans. Well, thousands of Arabs are going to join the British effort, fight and die to defeat the Ottomans. They're going to do a great job in tying up a lot of Ottoman soldiers so that they can't go fight in Europe, and the Ottomans will eventually, their side's going to lose. So when the war was over and it was time for Britain to make good on its promise, the British instead decided, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to actually just split it up between us and the French. And so modern day Syria and Lebanon were given to the French. Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine were basically just, they drew up these makeshift borders. If you ever wonder why the borders in Africa and the Middle East are have so much longer, straighter lines, it's because it was drawn by colonial officials. Anyway, so the British, like I said, they're going to split it up between them and France. Now, not only that situation, which would have been controversial enough, there's going to be a political movement in Britain in particular, Zionism. Now, of course, Zionism is attached to many other older religious and political concepts. But at this time, there was a specific political movement in Britain that involved creating a state in Palestine and giving it to Jews. The result of this is going to be that hundreds of thousands of Arabs will be forcefully relocated in order to make room for a new Jewish state. And so, like I said, this was primarily promoted by British Parliament. And of course, that's been a source of contention, to say the least, between the Muslim world and the West ever since. Remember the Treaty of Versailles? There was a big debate about what exactly should be done to Germany after the war. The United States took the position, Wilson took the position of let's do something practical, something sustainable, where France, who had been destroyed and invaded, they wanted to be more punitive, punish the Germans. And so Germany was to be punished severely. Massive reparations were ordered. Germany was to be humiliated by the treaty, and it's going to lead to very serious economic problems in Germany, which will, long story short, eventually contribute to Nazism. There's a million specifics I'm glossing over to say that, but I'm just making the connection there. A part of all this, which is related to political changes in the United States, there's going to be what's known as the Red Scare. The most famous version of the Red Scare is associated with the 1950s, like McCarthyism. This was its forerunner. So the Red Scare in the U.S. After the example of the Communist Revolution in Russia, much of the capitalist democratic world became paranoid about a possible worldwide revolution. And to be clear, the Soviet Union did put together an organization with just that purpose, known as the Comintern. So it wasn't just irrational fear. I mean, communism the point was to, spread the whole world. So for what we're seeing as practical reasons, civil liberties were sharply reduced, and suspicion of treason and dissent or revolution became widespread in the United States. And you're going to have government raids. They're going to result in around 4,000 warrantless arrests, thousands of deportations based on shaky evidence, or maybe no evidence, maybe just a rumor. That would happen frequently too. Eventually, this is going to, like all episodes of paranoia and fear, will calm down eventually. But it's a very clear example of how fear, paranoia, ideas about an emergency can lead to stepping all over or ignoring the Constitution.